Hello, greetings from Chicago. I'm David Gunkel, the author of The Machine Question and Robot Rights and professor of communication technology at Northern Illinois University. Uh, I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about the relational turn in ethics, or what can be called social relational ethics, as an alternative to sort of standard ways of deciding some of the persistently difficult questions in engineering ethics and other areas in which we're confronted with other kinds of objects and entities that sort of ask us to come up with a way of responding and taking responsibility for these technologies and how they factor into and affect our lives. So the usual way we do ethics, when you look at how we make a decision, is we sort of cut up the world into things that are just things and persons. So we have this idea in law where you're either a person or property, and persons are subject to the law, they are subjects of the law, whereas property are items that are owned by persons and therefore don't have the same status with regards to the standing they have in the face of the law or within our moral systems. Now, the way we normally just make this dividing line between the who and the what, or the thing and the person, is we try to come up with a set of qualifying ontological properties. Things like consciousness or sentience or emotion or some other kind of criteria that we utilize to say, well, if it has this thing, then we have to treat it as another person. If it doesn't have this thing, then it's just an object. So if you're looking at a situation where you're trying to decide how to treat your dog versus a rock, right? You'll say, well, the rock isn't sentient, so obviously I could throw it, I could kick it, I could do whatever I want to it because it doesn't feel anything, it doesn't care about anything. Whereas the dog is sentient and therefore does require some modicum of respect with regards to its feelings, with regards to its status. Now, this works in a lot of circumstances where we're trying to decide the who versus the what, the person versus the thing. But it does run into trouble because a lot of these decisions that we make on ontological grounds come before we take up a relation to the object or have a moral commitment to the object. So you run into some troubles when you try to figure out how to mobilize this properties approach, as it's called, to deciding moral status. One problem is substantive. Which of the properties are the ones that are important? Is it consciousness? Is that necessary and sufficient? Is it sentient? Is that necessary and sufficient for moral status? And when you look at the history of moral philosophy, you'll notice that the criteria change over time. At one time, way back in the ancient Greek period, the criteria for moral considerability was that you're a white guy. Only white men were considered moral subjects and everything else was their property. So women, children, slaves, animals were all property of a head of the household who in most cases was a white male. So, when Odysseus comes back from the wars in Troy, as recorded in Homer's The Odyssey, the first thing he does is he hangs all the slave girls because he suspects them of doing something behind his back while he was gone. Now, at the time that he does this, this is not considered a moral problem because slave girls are just tools. And since he is the only moral subject, he can do with them as he pleases. Now, from our perspective, this looks absolutely barbaric and is definitely a moral problem. But this has to do with the sort of instability of this properties approach and deciding which properties are the substantive properties for moral status. There's also a terminological problem. When you select a property like consciousness, then you say, okay, so let's define consciousness. And you find out that defining consciousness is really hard. If you look at the number of people who've offered definitions of consciousness, what you see is that we really don't know what consciousness is when we actually have to nail it down and give it a very standard and rigorous definition. Same thing with sentience. What is necessary and sufficient for sentience? I mean, it's one thing to say that sentience is the criteria for moral considerability, but then you've got to define sentience and you realize that just like consciousness, sentience is a rather difficult criteria criteria to give a rigorous definition to that would hold up across different applications. Lastly, there's epistemological problems with the properties approach. That is, I know I'm a thinking, feeling thing, but how do I know you are? And the fact is I can't climb inside your head to see what happens inside your own thinking apparatus. All I can do is observe your behavior, and as a regards of your behavior, make a certain educated guess as to what causes that behavior. And therefore, we're always confronted with the other mind's problem. We know the mind of ourselves, we don't know the mind of another entity. And so a lot of the decision making that goes on with the properties approach runs into an epistemological sort of barrier, which has to make decisions about others when we don't really know a whole lot about them, when we just have the evidence of behavior to look at and to make decisions from exhibited behavior and not from actual, certitude about what is causing that behavior. So in response to these problems, a number of philosophers, myself included, Mark Cockleberg and a few others, have proposed what we call the relational turn. And the relational turn is another way of doing ethics that is, we hope, a little more honest and a little more empirical when it comes to dealing with others and responding to the challenge that others present to us in terms of their moral considerability. The relational turn is, as the word says, relational. It's about relationships. It says that ethics arises not out of nothing. It arises from relationships that we have with others in actual social circumstances. And that, in fact, when you look at the chain of causality, we first confront the other before we know anything about them. And we have to respond to them before we have any knowledge about the inner workings of their mind or their availability of consciousness or sentience, that the ethical component actually comes first before the ontological component. And so we make a decision in the face of things, as Emmanuel Levinas would say. And then after we make that decision, we do all the ontological machinations necessary to sort of justify that decision that we made. But the relational turn says if the first thing we encounter is the relationship we have with others, then we should really be very focused on that relational situation and the social circumstance. For this reason, the relational turn is radically empirical. It doesn't have to solve the other mind's problem. In fact, in the relational approach to things, it's about the face or the facing of the other and not the mind of the other. And so you don't have to actually do all the calculations about what must go on inside the head or the apparatus of the other entity, but rather what is the situation that you encounter, socially speaking, in your relationship to this other entity. And so as an empirical sort of morality, it is much more about the sort of phenomenon of the encounter than it is with the sort of ontological decision making about the inner workings of that entity. And therefore, the other mind's problem is not really a problem. It's not in play because you don't have to solve the epistemological difficulties before you make your decision about how to treat things. Lastly, the relational turn is altruistic in a very literal sense. It is related to others. Alterity, I guess, is the word that means otherness. And the relational turn is always focused on that other that is in relationship to you. And as a result, it is altruistic, very literally speaking, because it's focused on and it's turned towards the other and the otherness of the other. And as a result, the relational turn is able to accommodate all kinds of others, not just other people, but other animals, the environment, and objects like robots and AI. And as a result of this, the relational turn is a little more open to accommodating the moral challenges that come from our encounters with other kinds of otherness. Now, in saying this, I don't mean to say that the relational turn is a moral theory of everything. It is just, we hope, a more honest, more empirical way of doing ethics that allows for some different opportunities that have been sort of left out of the mix when we look at things from the properties approach. So we can still use the properties approach, and it still is serviceable in many applications and places. But there are some situations in which the properties approach really runs up against its own limitations. And it's in respect of those limitations and attempting to respond to those limitations that the social relational approach, or the relational turn, has been developed as a way of creating an alternative that allows for some different opportunities. So I hope that gives you something to work with. Obviously, there's things you can read on the subject, but I had my intention being with this video at least to introduce you to the idea and open up some questions and some avenues of inquiry that you may want to explore further in the work that you do. So thank you for your attention. Good luck with your own projects, and I look forward to seeing what you do with it. Thanks. Bye.